Edward R. Murrow speaks on TV journalism. This just might do nobody any good. At the end of this discourse, a few people may accuse this reporter of fouling his own comfortable nest, and your organization may be accused of having given hospitality to heretical and even dangerous thoughts. But the elaborate structure of networks, advertising agencies, and sponsors will not be shaken or altered. It is my desire, if not my duty, to try and talk to you journeymen with some candor about what is happening to radio and television. You should also know at the outset that, in the matter of witnesses before congressional committees, I appear here voluntarily, by invitation, that I am an employee of the Columbia Broadcasting System, that I am neither an officer nor a director of that corporation, and that these remarks are of a do-it-yourself nature. If what I have to say is responsible, then I alone am responsible for the saying of it. I have no feud, either with my employers, any sponsors, or with the professional critics of radio and television. But I am seized with an abiding fear regarding what these two instruments are doing to our society, our culture, and our heritage. Recently, network spokesmen have been disposed to complain that the professional critics of television have been rather beastly. There have been hints that somehow competition for the advertising dollar has caused the critics of print to gang up on television and radio. This reporter has no desire to defend the critics. They have space in which to do that on their own behalf. But it remains a fact that the newspapers and magazines are only instruments of mass communication which remain free from sustained and regular critical comment. If the network spokesmen are so anguished about what appears in print, let them come forth and engage in a little sustained and regular comment regarding newspapers and magazines. It is an ancient and sad fact that most people in network television and radio have an exaggerated regard for what appears in print. And there have been cases where executives have refused to make even private comment on a program for which they are responsible until they had read the reviews in print. This is hardly an exhibition of confidence. The oldest excuse of the networks for their timidity is their youth. Their spokesmen say, "We are young. We have not developed the traditions nor acquired the experience of the older media." If they but knew it, they are building those traditions, creating those precedents every day. Each time they yield to a voice from Washington or any political pressure, each time they eliminate something that might offend some section of the community, they are creating their own body of precedent and tradition. They are, in fact, not content to be half safe. Nowhere is this better illustrated than by the fact that the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission publicly prods broadcasters to engage in their legal right to editorialize. Of course, to undertake an editorial policy, overt and clearly labeled, and obviously unsponsored, requires a station or network to be responsible. Most stations today probably do not have the manpower to assume this responsibility, but the manpower could be recruited. Editorials would not be profitable. If they had a cutting edge, they might even offend. It is much easier, much less troublesome, to use the money-making machine of television and radio merely as a conduit, which to channel anything that is not libelous, obscene, or defamatory. In that way, one has the illusion of power without responsibility. My memory also goes back to the time when the fear of a slight reduction in business did not result in an immediate cutback in bodies in the News and Public Affairs Department, at a time when network profits had just reached an all-time high. We would all agree, I think, that whether a station or a network, the stapling machine is a poor substitute for a newsroom typewriter. One of the minor tragedies of television news and information is that the networks will not even defend their vital interests. When my employer, CBS, through a combination of enterprise and good luck, did an interview with Nikita Khrushchev, the president uttered a few ill-chosen, uninformed words on the subject, and the network practically apologized. This produced a rarity. Many newspapers defended the CBS right to produce the program and commend it for initiative, but the other networks remained silent. Likewise, when John Foster Dulles, by personal decree, banned American journalists from going to communist China and subsequently offered contradictory explanations, for his fiat the networks entered only a mild protest. Then they apparently forgot the unpleasantness. Can it be that this national industry is content to serve the public interest only with the trickle of news that comes out of Hong Kong, to leave its viewers in ignorance of the cataclysmic changes that are occurring in a nation of 600 million people. I have no illusions about the difficulties of reporting from a dictatorship, but our British and French allies have been better served, in their public interest, with some very useful information from their reporters in communist China. Sometimes there is a clash between the public interest and the corporate interest. A telephone call or a letter from the proper quarter in Washington is treated rather more seriously than a communication from an irate but not politically potent viewer. It is tempting enough to give away a little airtime for frequently irresponsible and unwanted utterances in an effort to temper the wind of criticism. Upon occasion, economics and editorial judgment are in conflict, and there is no law which says that dollars will be defeated by duty. Not so long ago, the President of the United States delivered a television address to the nation. He was discoursing on the possibility or probability of war between this nation, the Soviet Union, and Communist China. A reasonably compelling subject. Two networks, CBS and NBC, delayed that broadcast for an hour and 15 minutes. If this decision was dictated by anything other than financial reasons, the network didn't deign to explain those reasons. That hour and 15-minute delay, by the way, is about twice the time required for an ICBM to travel from the Soviet Union to major targets in the United States. It is difficult to believe that this decision was made by men who love, respect, and understand news. So far, I've been dealing largely with the deficit side of the ledger, and the items could be expanded. But as I've said, and I believe, potentially we have in this country a free enterprise system of radio and television which is superior to any other. But to achieve its promise, it must be both free and enterprising. There is no suggestion here that networks or individual stations should operate as philanthropies. But I can find nothing in the Bill of Rights or Communications Act which says that they must increase their net profits each year, lest the republic collapse. I do not suggest that news and information should be subsidized by foundations or private subscriptions. I am aware that the networks have expended and are expending very considerable sums of money on public affairs programs from which they cannot hope to receive any financial reward. I have had the privilege at CBS of presiding over a considerable number of such programs. I testify, and am able to stand here and say, that I have never had a program turned down by my superiors because of the money it would cost. But we all know that you cannot reach the potential maximum audience in marginal time with a sustaining program. This is so because so many stations on the network, any network, will decline to carry it. Every licensee who applies for a grant to operate in the public interest, convenience and necessity makes certain promises as to what he will do in terms of program content. Many recipients of licenses have, in blunt language, welched on these promises. The money-making machine somehow blunts their memories. The only remedy for this is closer inspection and punitive action by the FCC. But in the view of many, this would come perilously close to supervision of program content by a federal agency. So it seems that we cannot rely on philanthropic support or foundation subsidies. We cannot follow the sustaining route in the network. The networks cannot pay all the freight, and the FCC cannot or will not discipline those who abuse the facilities that belong to the public. What, then, is the answer? Do we merely stay on our comfortable nests, concluding that the obligation of these instruments has been discharged when we work at the job of informing the public for a minimum of time? Or do we believe that the preservation of the Republic is a 7-day-a-week job demanding more awareness, better skill, and more perseverance than we have yet contemplated? I am frightened by the imbalance, the constant striving to reach the largest possible audience for everything, by the absence of a sustained study of the state of the nation. Heywood Brown once said, "No body politic is healthy until it begins to itch." I would like television to produce some itching pills, rather than this endless outpouring of tranquilizers. It can be done. Maybe it won't be, but it could. Let us not shoot the wrong piano player. Do not be deluded into believing that the titular heads of the networks control what appears on their networks. They all have better taste. all are responsible to stockholders, and in my experience, all are honorable men. But they must schedule what they can sell in the public market. And this brings us to the nub of the question. In one sense, it rather revolves around the phrase heard frequently along Madison Avenue, the corporate image. I am not precisely sure what this phrase means, but I would imagine that it reflects a desire on the part of the corporations who pay the advertising bills to have the public image, or believe that they are not merely bodies with no souls, panting in pursuit of elusive dollars. They would like us to believe that they can distinguish between the public good and the private or corporate gain. So the question is this: are the big corporations who pay the freight for radio and television programs wise to use the time exclusively for the sale of goods and services? Is it in their own interest, that of the stockholders, so to do? The sponsor of an hour's television program is not buying merely the 6 minutes devoted to the commercial message. He is determining, within broad limits, the sum total of the impact of the entire hour. If he always, invariably, reaches for the largest possible audience, then the process of insulation, of escape from reality, will continue to be massively financed, and its apologists will continue to make winsome speeches about giving the public what it wants or letting the public decide. I refuse to believe the presidents and chairmen of the boards of these big corporations want their corporate image to consist exclusively of a solemn voice in an echo chamber, or a pretty girl opening the door of a refrigerator, or a horse that talks. They want something better, and on occasion some of them have demonstrated it. But most of the men whose legal and moral responsibility it is to spend the stockholders' money for advertising are removed from the realities of the mass media by 5, 6, or a dozen contraceptive layers of vice presidents, public relations counsel, and advertising agencies. Their business is to sell goods, and the competition is pretty tough. But this nation is now in competition with the malignant forces of evil who are using every instrument at their command to empty the minds of their subjects and fill those minds with slogans, determination, and faith in the future. If we go on as we are protecting the mind of the American public from any real contact with the menacing world that squeezes in upon us. We are engaged in a great experiment to discover whether a free public opinion can devise and direct methods of managing the affairs of the nation. We may fail, but we are handicapping ourselves needlessly. Let us have a little competition, not only in selling soap, cigarettes, and automobiles, but in forming a troubled, apprehensive, but receptive public. Why should not each of the 20 or 30 big corporations who dominate radio and television decide that they will give up 1 or 2 of their regularly scheduled programs each year, turn the time over to the networks, and say in effect, this is a tiny tithe, just a little bit of our profits. On this particular night, we aren't going to try to sell cigarettes or automobiles. This is merely a gesture to indicate our belief in the importance of ideas. The network should, and I think they would, pay for the cost of producing the program. The advertiser, the sponsor, would get name credit, but would have nothing to do with the content of the program. Would this blemish the corporate image? Will the stockholders object? I think not. If the premise upon which our pluralistic society rests, which as I understand it, is that if the people are given sufficient, undiluted information, they will then somehow, even after long, sober second thoughts, reach the right decision. If that premise is wrong, then not only the corporate image, but the corporations are done for. There used to be an old phrase in this country, employed when someone talked too much. It was, go hire a hall. Under this proposal, the sponsor would have hired the hall. He has bought the time. The local station operator, no matter how indifferent, is going to carry the program. He has to. Then it's up to the network to fill the hall. And I'm not here talking about editorializing, but about straightaway exposition as direct, unadorned, and impartial as fallible human beings can make it. Just once in a while, let us exalt the importance of ideas and information. Let us dream to the extent of saying that on a given Sunday night, the time normally occupied by Ed Sullivan is given over to a clinical survey of the state of American education, and a week or two later, the time normally used by Steve Allen is devoted to a thoroughgoing study of American policy in the Middle East. Will the corporate image of their respective sponsors be damaged? Would the stockholders rise up in their wrath and complain? Would anything happen other than a few million people would have received a little illumination on subjects that might well determine the future of this country, and therefore the future of the corporations? It may be that the present system, with no modifications and no experiments, can survive. Perhaps the money-making machine has some kind of built-in perpetual motion, but I do not think so. To a very considerable extent, the media of mass communication in a given country reflect the political, economic, and social climate in which they flourish. This is the reason ours differ from the British and the French, or the Russian and the Chinese. We are currently wealthy, fat, comfortable, and complacent. We have currently a built-in allergy to unpleasant or disturbing information. Our mass media reflects this. But unless we get up off our fat surpluses and recognize that television in the main is being used to distract, delude, amuse, and insulate us, then television and those who finance it, those who look at it, and those who work at it, may see a totally different picture too late. I do not advocate that we turn television into a 27-inch wailing wall where long hairs constantly moan about the state of our culture and our defense, but I would just like to see it reflect occasionally the hard, unyielding realities of the world in which we live. I would like to see it done inside the existing framework, and I would like to see the doing of it redound to the credit of those who finance and program it. Measure the results by Nielsen, Trendex, or Silex. It doesn't matter. The main thing is to try. The responsibility can be easily placed in spite of all the mouthings about giving the public what it wants. It rests on big business and on big television, and it rests at the top. Responsibility is not something that can be assigned or delegated, and it promises its own reward: good business and good television. Perhaps no one will do anything about it. I have ventured to outline it against a background of criticism that may have been too harsh only because I could think of nothing better. Someone once said, I think it was Max Eastman, that the publisher serves his advertiser best, who best serves his readers. I cannot believe that radio and television, or the corporations that finance the programs, are serving well or truly their viewers or listeners, or themselves. I began by saying that our history will be what we make it. If we go on as we are, then history will take its revenge, and retribution will not limp in catching up with us. We are to a large extent an imitative society. One or two or three corporations would undertake to devote just a small fraction of their advertising appropriation along the lines that I have suggested, the procedure would grow by contagion. The economic burden would be bearable, and there might ensure a most exciting adventure: exposure to ideas and the bringing of reality into the homes of the nation. To those who say people wouldn't look, they wouldn't be interested, they're too complacent, indifferent, and insulated, I can only reply, there is, in one reporter's opinion, considerable evidence against that contention. But even if they are right, what have they got to lose? Because if they are right, and this instrument is good for nothing but to entertain, amuse, and insulate, then the tube is flickering now, and we will soon see that the whole struggle is lost. This instrument can teach, it can illuminate, yes, and it can even inspire, but can do so only to the extent that humans are determined to use it to these ends. Otherwise it is merely wires and lights in a box. There is great and perhaps decisive battle to be fought against ignorance, intolerance, and indifference. This weapon of television could be useful. Stonewall Jackson, who knew something about the use of weapons, is reported to have said, "When war comes, you must draw the sword and throw away the scabbard." The trouble with television is that it is resting in the scabbard during a battle for survival.